She stepped off the train expecting the words, "Go back where you came from." Instead, the lonely cowboy looked into her frightened eyes, took her worn suitcase, smiled gently, and whispered just 4 words, "Welcome home." What happened next changed 4 lonely hearts forever. Stay until the end, because this unforgettable Wild West love story proves that sometimes a family begins with one act of kindness. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional Wild West stories filled with hope, love, and second chances. The shrill whistle of the steam locomotive echoed across the quiet frontier as the train slowly rolled into the small railroad station. Dust swirled beneath iron wheels while passengers stepped onto the weathered wooden platform, greeted by loved ones, wagons, and cheerful smiles. But one young woman remained standing beside the last train car, clutching a worn leather travel bag with trembling hands. Her name was Eleanor. After weeks of traveling across the country as a mail-order bride, she had imagined this moment countless times. Yet every hopeful dream had slowly been replaced by fear. She had heard too many stories of women being rejected the instant they arrived, called too old, too plain, or simply unwanted. Looking down at her simple cream-colored dress and faded shawl, she whispered to herself, "If he changes his mind, I'll leave without making it harder." The conductor nodded kindly before climbing back aboard, leaving her alone beneath the endless prairie sky. Across the platform stood Caleb Turner, a hard-working cowboy in his early 40s whose life had revolved around 2 small children ever since illness claimed his beloved wife 3 years earlier. His ranch sat several miles outside town, surrounded by open grasslands and gentle hills. Though neighbors often encouraged him to remarry, Caleb never searched for beauty or wealth. He simply wanted someone with patience, kindness, and enough courage to help build a loving home for his son Tommy and his daughter Grace. As the train came to a stop, Tommy squeezed his father's hand while Grace hid shyly behind him, peeking curiously toward the passengers. One by one, travelers reunited with waiting families until only Eleanor remained. She lowered her eyes, convinced no one had come for her. Slowly, she picked up her bag and turned toward the road leading out of town. Before taking another step, she heard calm footsteps behind her. Eleanor. She turned nervously. Standing before her was a broad-shouldered cowboy wearing a weathered hat and a warm smile that carried none of the judgment she expected. "I'm Caleb." She immediately looked down. "I'm sorry if I'm not what you hoped for." Caleb seemed confused. "I understand if you've changed your mind," she continued quietly. "It happens." Instead of answering immediately, Caleb reached for her heavy suitcase. Then, with gentle sincerity, he smiled and said the words she never expected to hear. "Welcome home." For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at him. No criticism, no disappointment, no cold silence. Only kindness. Little Grace stepped forward first, holding out a tiny wildflower she had picked beside the station. "We brought this for you," she whispered. Tommy grinned. "P.S. says our house has been too quiet." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes before she could stop them. No one had welcomed her anywhere in years. As they climbed into the wagon together, Caleb noticed she kept glancing backward toward the train, almost as if expecting someone to call her back. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said gently. "This road leads home." But for the first time since leaving everything behind, Eleanor allowed herself to believe. Maybe it truly did. Life on Caleb's ranch was simple, but it was filled with honest work from sunrise until sunset. Eleanor expected to be treated like a stranger, yet from her very first morning, Caleb handed her no impossible expectations, only trust. He quietly showed her the garden, the chicken coop, and the small kitchen where his late wife had once baked bread. "Do what feels right," he said. "This is your home too." Those words stayed with Eleanor all day. She cleaned the dusty shelves, stitched torn curtains, baked fresh biscuits from the little flour they had left, and filled the lonely cabin with warmth that had been missing for years. When Caleb returned from repairing fences that evening, he stopped at the doorway. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the cabin, while Tommy and Grace laughed around the table. For the first time since losing his wife, the ranch no longer felt empty. Days slowly turned into weeks, and the children grew deeply attached to Eleanor. Every morning Grace insisted on helping her knead bread, while Tommy proudly carried firewood beside her, pretending he was already strong enough to protect the whole ranch. At bedtime, Eleanor read them stories by lantern light until both children fell asleep smiling. She never tried to replace their mother. Instead, she honored her memory with kindness, patience, and gentle love. The children noticed the difference. One chilly evening, Grace quietly slipped her tiny hand into Eleanor's and whispered, "I don't remember Mama's voice anymore. But when you sing, it feels warm again." Eleanor turned away so the little girl wouldn't see the tears in her eyes. Not everyone in town welcomed the new bride. During a trip to the general store, several women whispered behind Eleanor's back, "Mail-order brides never stay long," one scoffed. Another laughed, "She'll leave before winter." Eleanor heard every word but lowered her eyes and said nothing. Caleb, however, had heard enough. He calmly stepped beside her, placed the flour sack in the wagon, and looked at the gossiping crowd. "She crossed half a country to build a family," he said firmly. "Anyone brave enough to do that deserves respect." The whispers stopped instantly. On the ride home, Eleanor softly asked, "Why do you defend me?" Caleb smiled without taking his eyes off the trail. "Because family stands together." Those simple words meant more to Eleanor than any promise ever could. As autumn faded and the first snowflakes drifted across the prairie, the cabin glowed each evening with laughter, warm meals, and children's voices. Caleb often found himself watching Eleanor teaching Grace to sew or helping Tommy with his school lessons, and he realized something remarkable. She had arrived believing she was only a stranger, but without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. She had already become the heart of their home. Winter arrived with a quiet strength that covered the prairie in deep white snow and wrapped the rolling hills in silence. Every morning, smoke curled gently from the chimney of Caleb's ranch house, while warm lantern light glowed through frosted windows. Months earlier, that cabin had been little more than a lonely place where a tired father and two grieving children simply existed from one day to the next. Now it echoed with laughter, fresh bread baking in the oven, cheerful conversations around the supper table, and the joyful sound of little feet running across wooden floors. Eleanor often stood at the kitchen window before sunrise, watching snowflakes drift over the pasture while preparing breakfast. She still woke each morning amazed that no one had asked her to leave. Every blanket she folded, every meal she prepared, and every smile she shared felt like a quiet thank you for the chance Caleb had given her. Caleb noticed it all. He noticed how she always served the children first before filling her own plate. He noticed how she carefully repaired Tommy's torn coat late at night after everyone else had gone to sleep. He noticed how Grace laughed more than she had in years. Most of all, he noticed that the heavy loneliness he had carried since losing his wife no longer followed him everywhere he went. One snowy afternoon, Caleb rode into town to buy seed, flour, and supplies for the coming spring. Eleanor came along with the children. As they entered the general store, the same people who had once whispered cruel things about the mail-order bride looked at her differently. An elderly woman smiled. "I heard you helped Mrs. Carter when she fell ill," another rancher's wife added, "and my little boy still talks about the pie you baked for the church supper." Soon more neighbors gathered around. Instead of judging Eleanor, they thanked her. Not because she was beautiful, not because she had arrived as a bride, but because she had quietly become the kindest person many of them had ever known. On their way home, Grace rode beside Eleanor in the wagon. "Do you know something?" the little girl asked. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I don't get scared when it snows anymore." "Why not?" Grace smiled. "Because you're always waiting for us when we come home." Those simple words touched Eleanor more deeply than she could explain. That evening, after supper, Tommy disappeared into the barn. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box he had secretly spent weeks building with Caleb's help. The little boy placed it carefully into Eleanor's hands. "For you." She slowly opened the lid. Inside lay 3 tiny treasures: a smooth river stone, a dried prairie flower, and a folded piece of paper. "What are these?" she asked softly. Tommy pointed proudly. The stone is because you're strong. The flower is because you're kind. And the paper, he hesitated. Grace wrote that. Eleanor unfolded it carefully. In crooked handwriting were only 4 simple words. Thank you for staying. Before Eleanor realized it, tears rolled gently down her cheeks. For years she had searched for acceptance. She had expected marriage to be nothing more than an agreement between strangers. Instead, she had found a family. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep, Caleb stepped onto the porch where Eleanor stood watching the moonlight shimmer across the snow-covered prairie. Neither spoke for several moments. Sometimes silence carried more meaning than words. Finally, Caleb broke the quiet. When I wrote for a mail-order bride, he smiled thoughtfully. I figured I was asking for someone to help with cooking, cleaning, and looking after 2 children. Eleanor lowered her eyes. I hope I haven't disappointed you. Caleb gently shook his head. You've done far more than that. He looked toward the glowing cabin windows where Tommy and Grace slept peacefully. You gave 2 children their laughter back. He paused. You gave this old house a heartbeat again. And Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I thought I came here because you needed me. I did, but I never realized. He took a slow breath. How much I needed someone to remind me what hope felt like. The cold wind whispered through the pine trees. Caleb removed his weathered hat. Eleanor, she looked up. When you stepped off that train, you expected me to send you away. She nodded. I was ready for goodbye. Caleb smiled warmly. I'm thankful every day that I chose different words. He gently reached for her hand. Welcome home. Those same 4 words that had greeted her months before now carried an even deeper meaning. They no longer welcomed a stranger. They belonged to the woman who had become the heart of their family. Spring arrived at last. The snow melted into rushing streams. Wildflowers painted the prairie with color once again. Neighbors often stopped by the ranch, amazed at the joyful home that stood where loneliness had once lived. Children's laughter floated across the fields. Fresh bread cooled on open windowsills. The old rocking chair on the porch was never empty for long. One Sunday after church, the town pastor smiled at Caleb. You've been blessed. Caleb looked across the yard where Eleanor was teaching Grace to plant flowers, while Tommy proudly followed with a watering bucket. No, Caleb replied quietly. I was given a second chance. Years later, travelers passing through the valley often asked how the little ranch had become known as the happiest home on the frontier. Old neighbors always smiled before answering. It all started the day a frightened mail-order bride stepped off a train expecting rejection. And one lonely cowboy greeted her with 4 simple words, welcome home. From that moment forward, they proved that families are not built by perfect beginnings, wealth, or appearances. They are built by kindness, strengthened by trust, protected by sacrifice, and kept together by love that chooses to stay. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that the greatest words a lonely soul can ever hear are not, I love you, but welcome home. We'll see you in the next unforgettable Wild West story.